Snow fell without shape or mercy over the Ardennes, the kind of snow that erases direction and softens death. It was December 1944, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the German counteroffensive rolled westward. In this frozen forest, Bastogne stood like a nail hammered into the heart of Europe, surrounded, starving, yet unbent. Inside the town, the men of the 101st Airborne dug into frost-hardened earth. Their breath turned to mist among silent ruins, rifles iced to their touch. Rations were measured in spoonfuls, fuel in whispers. Radios crackled, batteries fading beneath the cold. Overhead, the sky was an iron lid sealing them in, and somewhere beyond that lid, distant generals drew blue lines on maps that no longer matched reality. One of those lines crossed a name scrawled on a mud-caked dashboard: Faith, the last working jeep in the battalion's motor pool. Its driver, Private Earl Compton, had patched it so many times that the mechanics joked it was more wire than vehicle. Bullet holes in the hood had been taped shut with ration tins. The front fender bore the memory of Normandy. The left door, scars from Market Garden. Now its right axle sagged, cracked in two. For most men it was scrap. For Compton, it was hope shaped in steel. That night, artillery thundered around Bastogne like distant drums of gods deciding fates. In a ruined barn converted into a workshop, Compton crouched beside the jeep, lantern flickering against frost. He had no spare parts, only scavenged radio wire, the rusted arm of a broken shovel, and stubbornness. His fingers bled from the cold, tightening makeshift clamps until they bit into skin. Outside, the town murmured. Medics whispering prayers, soldiers stamping feet for warmth, officers tracing circles on maps with trembling pencils. At 2 a.m, the first report came through. Noville outpost cut off to the north. 90 men trapped, ammunition low, communication failed. Someone had to break through with new coordinates and orders to hold until relief arrived. But the eastern road was gone, mined and shelled. The western track was a wasteland of shattered trucks. Only one vehicle could possibly weave through the debris. The last jeep, the one everyone had written off. Can she still move? Major Winters asked without enthusiasm. Compton ran his hand along the cold hood and replied, "She will." The major hesitated, aware that faith was no substitute for mechanics, and yet in Bastogne both carried equal weight. When dawn came, a gray veil lifted from the forest. The trees looked like charred bones rising from snow. Compton primed the engine. The starter coughed, hesitated, then flared alive in a sputter of blue smoke. Men stopped what they were doing just to listen. The sound was heavenly in a place where everything else had fallen silent. One by one they gathered, smiling faintly as if to share a secret. Movement still existed, and that meant survival. Before leaving, Compton carved a small cross into the jeep's dash, next to the initials of those already lost. Mendez, his radio operator, climbed beside him, holding the dispatch packet under his coat. They said little, words weighed too much. The road ahead might not exist. But the order was clear. Deliver the message. Keep Noville alive. As the jeep rolled through Bastogne's western gate, snow thickened again, swirling like ash from invisible fires. Houses watched in silence, windows cracked with frost. The jeep's lights cut thin tunnels through the fog, barely enough to see the path before them. Behind, the town vanished into white, a fading heartbeat swallowed by storm and war. That morning, somewhere among the pines, German columns prepared to close the noose completely. Engines rumbled, maps unfolded, confidence thickened in the cold air. Neither side knew yet that the smallest, most fragile machine on the battlefield was about to alter everything, not through victory, but survival. The road from Bastogne toward Noville had ceased to be a road weeks before. It was a wound carved by retreat and shellfire. Frozen craters glittered like mirrors in which men glimpsed their exhaustion. Each mile seemed stitched together by wreckage, burnt half-tracks, shattered cartwheels, and helmets frozen into puddles of ice. Yet into this wasteland moved the last jeep, coughing and rattling like an animal too stubborn to die. Its headlights flickered in intervals, dim cones slicing the white dark. The rhythm almost human. Inhale, exhale, survive. Compton gripped the wheel until the skin on his knuckles split. Mendez read the compass, whispering bearings, though neither could see 10 yards ahead. The engine stuttered, the wired axle groaned, and the dashboard shook as if the machine were shivering from fear. Ammunition for their carbines rested on their laps. useless comfort. When the front tires struck a field of ice, the Jeep slid sideways, scraping against a frozen curb, but Compton kept it straight. Any stall would be fatal. The fuel reserve barely covered 20 miles. Behind them, Bastogne's thunder echoed faintly, the constant percussion of artillery. In solitude, sound transformed from noise to memory. The echo of voices lost, the laughter that once filled barracks, the prayers muttered during maintenance. The Jeep's shortwave radio crackled occasionally, coughing static like ghosts trying to speak. When Mendez tuned it, only fragments emerged, half messages, coordinates, numbers without sender. They listened anyway. Silence was more frightening. To the north, unseen beneath pine shadows, Oberleutnant Klein crouched beside maps spread across the hood of his half-track. He was 28, an engineer before the war, now tasked with cutting the last American escape route. His men were cold, hungry, and running on fumes. Tanks froze nightly, their engines seized by the Arctic air. Klein's orders came by field phone. The Americans must not reach Noville. He nodded, knowing obedience was simpler than logic. By midday, sunlight stabbed through the fog, revealing a valley so still it seemed carved from glass. Compton stopped to pour the last reserve of fuel from a jerry can. Frost bit through his gloves, but he worked fast, afraid to listen too closely to the forest. Mendez scanned the tree line through binoculars and glimpsed tracks, wide, mechanical, fresh. Panzers, he murmured. They were on parallel movement, less than 3 miles away. The Jeep lurched onward, slower now, tires crunching through frozen ruts. Every vibration felt like the heartbeat of fate. In that strange silence before contact, time dilated. Moments stretched so long that a breath could last an eternity. Compton thought of the mechanics back in Bastogne, the fragile laughter when the engine first started, the smell of coffee they no longer had. Holding the steering wheel, he realized he wasn't driving to Noville anymore. He was driving away from fear, chased by inevitability itself. From the ridge, Klein's forward patrol heard the distant sputter of an engine. Truck, one guessed. Klein knew better. Too light, too intermittent. Jeep, he said. He ordered 2 squads to intercept, each armed with machine guns and Panzerfausts. In theory, they would corner it easily. In practice, no theory survived the Ardennes fog. As dusk fell, the snow thickened into near blindness. Compton dimmed the headlights, relying solely on instinct and the ghostly glow of the frozen road. Then came the ambush, brief, sharp, and almost beautiful. Tracers cut through the night like comets. Mendez shouted a bearing. Compton jerked the wheel. Bullets punched through the windshield, spraying shards of glass across their faces. The Jeep fishtailed but did not die. The wired axles screamed yet held. Compton drove without thought, guided only by the roar of the engine, a sound stronger than fear. The Germans fired until their barrels steamed and visibility vanished. When silence returned, all that remained were twin ruts disappearing westward. They drove on until the fuel gauge trembled near empty. The map suggested Noville lay beyond a forested ridge 2 miles ahead. Both men knew the Jeep wouldn't make it. The axle rattled loose, every turn threatening to shear the wheel entirely. Mendez tightened the radio's antenna wire one last time, repeating his words like ritual. She'll hold. She always does. By then, their breath had frozen on their collars. The steering wheel gleamed with frost. Hours later, moonlight broke through the cloud cover. Pale, indifferent, vast. Beneath it, the Jeep rolled into a clearing littered with the charred remnants of another convoy. The bodies had been long removed, but the smell of burned oil lingered. There, hidden among the ruins, stood a barn half collapsed but still offering shelter from the wind. They pulled inside, killed the engine, and listened to the ticking metal cool. Mendez unwrapped the packet, reading aloud the words meant for Noville's command post. Revised coordinates, defensive positioning, authorization for emergency supply drops if weather allowed. Each sentence sounded heavier than the last. Delivering it felt impossible now. They slept in shifts, rifle across knees, hands numb. Somewhere in the early hours before dawn, the forest carried another sound, the whine of engines, German, heavy. Once more, Compton faced the dawn with only one thought. The message must move, even if the Jeep no longer could. Dawn arrived like a blade, thin, cold, merciless. It sliced through the fog above Noville and painted everything in tones of ash and ice. The forest that had hidden both armies now unveiled them. Broken machinery glittered beneath frost, rifles glinted like shards of bone, and even the dead seemed frozen mid-breath, still facing east as though waiting for orders that would never come. Compton awoke to the sound of dripping, melted frost tapping against the Jeep's cracked windshield. The engine had cooled into silence, its lifeblood of fuel gone. Mendez stood at the barn's doorway, watching clouds of breath rise toward pale sunlight. "We're out," he said simply. Compton didn't respond. He closed the packet of coordinates, slipped it under his coat, and stared at the lifeless machine that had carried them farther than reason allowed. The axle was bent like a severed limb, its wire binding snapped in places where the frost had grown too thick. Every contour of the Jeep whispered finality, and yet leaving it behind felt like betrayal. Outside, the valley stirred. Far off, low, rolling, methodical, came the growl of tanks. German armor descending from the northern hills. They were pushing the last kilometers toward Bastogne, unaware that their own fuel supply had already collapsed behind them. Klein's division advanced with half-filled tanks and promises that could not be kept. Mechanics drained sulfur-smelling sediment from drums, praying it would burn. Commanders issued reports filled with numbers that now meant nothing. The offensive still looked alive. It simply had no heart left to beat. Compton and Mendez started west on foot, following the remnants of a logging trail. Each step cracked the crusted snow with a sound sharper than gunfire. Behind them, the barn stood as a silhouette, smoke rising from its chimney as they left a small fire to mislead pursuit. As they climbed the ridge, flares bloomed in the distance, scarlet against the dawn, marking artillery adjustments. Then came the first shell, distant but deliberate, its explosion scattering snow like feathers across the horizon. Noville was burning again. Halfway up the ridge, they heard engines revving too close. German trucks, reconnaissance patrols searching for stragglers or imagining phantom breakthroughs. Mendez ducked behind a fallen pine, Compton beside him. Through the branches, they saw one half-track halt near the barn. Soldiers dismounted, shouting in curt bursts. Within minutes, gunfire erupted, short, precise. The barn caught flame, smoke curling into the pale sky. The Jeep was gone at last. Watching it burn, Compton felt unexpected relief, as though the war had claimed what it was owed. Then the unimaginable. Something within the barn exploded. A deep metallic thud shook the ridge. The Germans froze, looked skyward. "Fuel barrels," Mendez whispered. But those barrels shouldn't have ignited. The Jeep carried none. Seconds later, black smoke rose higher, thick and acrid. The German patrol panicked, shouting orders to withdraw before the flames reached them. They didn't realize the explosion was dry, mostly air, a deception. Yet the smoke's location was unmistakable to anyone scanning from higher ground. To Allied observers south of Bastogne, that smoke marked new German movement near Noville. Within 30 minutes, field commanders redirected artillery coverage. The coordinates Compton carried, now unnecessary, now fulfilled by luck, matched exactly with those guns already re-aiming. The broken Jeep, destroyed by accident, had signaled the Allied batteries more effectively than any radio could have. Rain of fire began to fall across the valley. Klein, standing by his command post under the pines, looked upward with disbelief. Shells burst in precise arcs, corridors of thunder walking toward his position. "How?" someone asked. He had no answer. His half-track lurched backward as the blast wave rolled through. Parts of the forest ignited, flames racing through dry roots like veins of light beneath snow. Klein ordered retreat, voice cracking, not from fear, but the sick knowledge that his formation was collapsing from the inside. Further south, Compton and Mendez reached the hilltop and saw it all. The German line folding, tanks turning in confusion, smoke curling over Noville like a dark crown. For a moment the forest glowed with contradictions, destruction birthing survival. Mendez whispered, "That was us." Compton shook his head. "No, that was her," he said, glancing toward the column of smoke where Faith had ended. The broken axle had fired the last shot. As afternoon descended, the sky cleared, and for the first time in 10 days, Allied aircraft appeared. Black silhouettes against gold light. They came low and wide, engines roaring with authority. Parachutes unfolded over Bastogne, dropping crates that gleamed silver against snow. The siege's famine was ending. The air bridge that Eisenhower had promised was finally open. On the ground, the surviving men at Noville raised helmets in salute, unaware of the insignificant, miraculous sequence that had bought them the hours necessary for salvation. By evening, Klein's division was collapsing eastward. Orders dissolved into survival instinct. Tanks lay abandoned where they stalled. Soldiers walked, weapons slung like burdens. Fuel, once the ambition of armies, had become their epitaph. One captured field message recorded Klein's final words before his radio went dead. "We have spirit, but spirit does not turn engines." It was both confession and farewell. Night fell blue and quiet. Compton and Mendez picked their path back toward Bastogne through fields aglow with distant fires. Above them, the aircraft still droned, guardians of a newfound sky. The war was not over, yet the balance had shifted. Somewhere far away, men in command tents would scribble victory reports, never knowing that one jeep, with a broken axle and more stubbornness than horsepower, had helped pivot the weight of a battle. They reached friendly lines before dawn. When the sentry challenged them, Compton simply held up the empty dispatch case, blackened, burned at its edges, and said, "Message delivered." No further explanation was needed. When the relief columns broke through to Bastogne on December 26, 1944, the world seemed to exhale. The snow that had once been a shroud now shimmered with sunlight, and the biting wind carried not fear, but the metallic scent of fuel and engine exhaust. Soldiers stumbled from their foxholes and cellars, faces gaunt and eyes hollow, blinking at the sight of tanks bearing white stars. They did not cheer at first. The sound felt foreign after so much silence. Slowly, laughter cracked through the numbness. The siege was lifted. They were still alive. Among them walked Private Earl Compton and Corporal Mendez, two shadows more than men. Their uniforms hung in tatters, and their boots leaked. They moved with the same mechanical persistence that had once driven their jeep. Behind them lay the ruins of the forest, burned by artillery, and ahead stretched a road lined with corpses of machines, twisted, still, and glittering under frost like museum exhibits of suffering. To the soldiers returning from Noville, that road had no normal name anymore. They called it the Spine of Faith. In Liège, weeks later, when the surviving vehicles were catalogued for repair, an engineer reported an unusual wreck near Noville. A jeep with its chassis melted to the floor, its axle snapped, its engine cylinder fused by fire. Beside it, he found a charred plate from a field ration box shaped into a crude cross still wired to the dash. It was tagged, crated, and forgotten among piles of wreckage. Only after the war would its serial number tie back to Bastogne's final dispatch mission. By then, most who knew the story had scattered across new wars or quiet towns. Time moved faster than gratitude, but the memory of motion remained. Within every division that had fought the Bulge, stories spread like campfire smoke, of a single jeep that crossed enemy lines, of artillery that turned death into rescue, of a signal fire mistaken for destruction that became salvation. Some said it was luck, others divine engineering. Compton had no interest in explanation. When reporters later asked how he'd repaired the vehicle, he smiled with tired eyes and said, "You fix what you have and keep it moving. That's all any of us did." The Germans who survived spoke differently. For many, Bastogne marked the collapsing point of a dream, the moment when discipline could no longer disguise exhaustion. Interrogated officers mentioned the cold, the starvation, the futility of calculating tactics without fuel. One handwritten note from Klein's staff, found months later in an abandoned truck, read, "The Americans fight with factories even when they are surrounded. We fought with courage, and courage has a limit." Those words would later haunt historians more than any battlefield statistic. By spring 1945, the war moved east. The forests thawed, revealing the bones of trucks and soldiers alike, perfectly preserved in frost. French villagers gathered scrap, bulldozers pushed steel aside, and the last evidence of that desperate December vanished beneath grass. Yet in Bastogne's museum today, atop a simple plinth, rests that same jeep, rusted, misshapen, untouched by restoration. The plaque beneath bears only 7 words: "Faith, the last jeep of Bastogne." Visitors run their fingers along its corroded fender, feeling grooves made not by design but by survival. Children listen to guides reciting its journey. Veterans stand silently, eyes wet, perhaps seeing not a machine but themselves, held together by wire, noise, and stubbornness. What makes the story linger is not victory but defiance. The broken axle never turned again, yet its failure had turned the fate of 100 men. As decades pass and the roar of engines becomes memory, the Jeep's story reminds generations what endurance truly means. Wars end, but the will that drives one exhausted soldier to push a crippled vehicle another meter forward endures beyond flags or front lines. Industrial might and human spirit met in that frozen valley, and for a fleeting moment became the same thing. When Compton died many years later, old and quiet in a Pennsylvania town, his son placed a photograph on his coffin, a black and white image of a Jeep half buried in snow. No caption was needed. Everyone who looked understood what it was. And so history closes with silence. Not the silence of peace, but of comprehension. That rare stillness when engines stop, guns cool, and the world finally measures the weight of all that moved to keep it turning. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.